yes, used to work in the HIV sector for many years, in fact, for decades. And I started becoming interested in growing older with HIV when the treatments, it was obvious that after 10 or 15 years of treatments, combination therapy, um, that people with HIV were likely to grow older. And so I started becoming quite interested in that in the late noughties, when I was working at Acon. And I then was on a board of an organisation called the Aged Care Rights Service, and the CEO role came up, and I applied for that role and became the CEO. And some people might know that organisation if you're in New South Wales. It's now called Seniors Rights Service because I did a rebrand when I was there. So I've put together some slides with the help from folk at Elder Abuse Action Australia. So when I was CEO of Seniors Rights Service, I also played a very active role in getting the Older Persons Advocacy Network, or some people know it as OPAN, up and running. And also another peak body around elder abuse and the legal issues surrounding elder abuse, which is funded by the Attorney General's Department, and that's Elder Abuse Action Australia. So Older Persons Advocacy Network predominantly advocates for people around aged care issues, and that's funded through Commonwealth Health, whereas EAAA, which you have on your screen now, is funded through Attorney General's, and it's predominantly around legal issues that affect older people who become victims of elder abuse. So if we can take the next slide. Okay, so that's just a little about me. I worked from the mid-80s, worked at Albion Street. I worked at Acon a couple of times. I worked at AFAO a couple of times. I worked at NAPWA when NAPWA was a project of AFAO, and I was also working at NAPWA when NAPWA got the first grant through Commonwealth Health through when Carmen Lawrence was Health Minister, for NAPWA to have its own funding stream, and I was its first paid employee under that single funding stream, which was separate to AFAO. And then for 5 years in early 2000s, I worked at GMHC, or Gay Men's Health Crisis, in New York City. And as I said, in 2011, I moved across to CEO of Seniors Rights Service. And at the moment, I'm a member of Commonwealth Health's Council of Elders. And the Council of Elders are a group of people that have been selected from around Australia who are older people who provide advice to the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing, as well as the Minister directly. So the Minister at the Commonwealth level for ageing is Sam Ray, and provide advice around the implementation of the recommendations from the Royal Commission into aged care, which was well over 5 years ago now. People would remember the Royal Commission into aged care.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a whole bunch of recommendations. And so the Council of Elders meant to be grassroots older people who provide advice on those, the implementation of those recommendations. Does anyone have any questions before we go on to the slides?
No.
Okay, so EAAA, there's information there about what EAAA does. I think the most important thing for this group is the fourth bullet point down around Compass, which is a national website, and in orange there in bold is compass.info. You can see in the middle of the screen. If people go to that website, not now, obviously, but at some point in the future, it's a very comprehensive website around elder abuse, how it affects people in Australia and how it affects different communities. And I would strongly encourage this group to engage with that resource. And there are plenty. You could write to EAAA, or there are places I can't recall exactly now, but there are places within the Compass website where you can provide feedback. And if people have case studies that are unique to people with HIV growing older around ageism or elder abuse, I would encourage people to share. It doesn't have to be identified case studies, it can be de-identified, but I'd encourage people to share that sort of information so that the issues that people in this group face actually get a wider audience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I'd mention is the very last bullet point. The community of organisations across Australia that deal with elder abuse, and they can be like tiny little domestic violence organisations, they can be tiny little grassroots community legal centres, or they can be statewide organisations like the one that I was running. All these different organisations are members of EAAA, and they have an annual conference. I think it's annual, or maybe it's every second year. I can't remember. But the 9th conference is coming up on the Gold Coast in the end of July. And again, I spoke to Bev Lang, by the way, and some of you might know and remember Bev Lang. She was Mardi Gras president for many years, and she also was CEO of Bobby Goldsmith Foundation, which was in the old ACOM building. And Bev and I used to work together when I worked at ACON, because I worked in client services. So what she was doing at the Bobby Goldsmith Foundation connected to the work of client services. Sorry, where was I going with that? The elder abuse conference. Oh, that's right. I was talking to Bev. The program's actually full already for the July conference. But I don't know what your funding's like, Adrian, but if you could get one or two people, even some Queensland-based people that you know, to go to the elder abuse conference and get a bit of a feel for it, and then definitely participate in. I would encourage people in this group to participate in next year's conference and maybe put in some papers, abstracts for some papers to be presented. If you feel you've got unique issues in this area. Does anyone have any questions? Because feel free to ask me stuff. No? Okay.
Elder abuse, I'm just curious, is elder abuse mainly coming from family members or organisation?
No. So elder abuse, there are some slides on this, but elder abuse predominantly is perpetrated by by people that the older person trusts the most.
Uh-huh.
So by that, elder abuse is perpetrated most often by the children of the older person, the grandchildren of the older person, or a service provider of the older person.
Uh-huh.
So it's somebody that they trust, and it's and again, there's slides on this, but the most common form of elder abuse is psychological abuse. But when I was working at Seniors' Rights Service, because we offered legal services, the most common, and again, it was a statewide service for New South Wales, the most common form of elder abuse that we would see was financial abuse. So financial abuse would be perpetrated uh, towards the older person by the children, the grandchildren, or friends of the older person. And financial abuse could look like anything like um, John would give Fred $200 out of his pension to get $200 worth of groceries every week, and Fred would come home with $100 worth of groceries.
Uh-huh.
For example, that would be an example. But then over time, that would be thousands of dollars.
Mm.
That would be sort of one of the lesser examples of financial abuse. One of the more extreme examples, yet a very common example, would be the perpetrator of elder abuse, of financial abuse, getting mum or dad, or if they're friends of the person, to sign the title deeds of the house
Oh.
to the children, um, and the children would run up debt and, uh, you know, would mortgage the house, run up debt, and then the older person would have to leave the house, and they may not be in a state where they're eligible for aged care, and they become homeless. And that story, believe it or not, is extremely common,
Oh my God.
like extremely common.
Mm.
And we would see that on a weekly basis. So yeah.
Mm. And inheritance, I imagine that the younger ones are hanging out for the inheritance.
Yeah. So that's another way of getting their inheritance early by doing the title deeds of the house, or 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 the other thing that's very common is, hey mum, we'll purchase this new house that we want to purchase. We'll put a granny flat out in the backyard. You sell your house, help us pay down the mortgage of this new big house that we want to purchase. You live rent free in our backyard in a granny flat, and we'll look after you health wise and in terms of getting meals for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the relationship breaks down. You know, they might have petty arguments over nothing that turn into big family disputes. There was no trace of who gave what money. You know, when mum sold her house to help out the kids with their mortgage to buy the new house, there's no trace of any of that. Everything was done on the back of an envelope, and that back of the envelope wasn't saved. And again, the older person finds it too unbearable and uncomfortable living in the granny flat, knowing that the children don't want her there anymore, and she moves out because it's easier just to move out, and again is homeless.
Oh, shocking.
So yeah, so the big thing around loaning money or trusting people when it comes to big financial decisions and selling houses to pay for someone else's mortgage and da 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 is to put everything in writing, even if it's not, you don't have to go to a lawyer and get it signed and countersigned, as long as it's all in writing and both parties sign it and there's a record of it somewhere. So if things do turn south, at least there's a record somewhere.
Yeah.
Because it's those sorts of family agreements or agreements between friends where they trust each other, but in 5 years' time, things go south. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay. Next slide. So, this is how elder abuse or the neglect of older people is defined by the World Health Organization. Just let people read that themselves. So that kind of encapsulates what I was just talking about. And so it's very much around um, the person who the older person trusts. You know, the trust is put into this other person. That trust breaks down, and that person ends up becoming the perpetrator of abuse or neglect. Next slide, unless there's questions. Okay, so one of the things that we lobbied for when I was working there and EAAA got started was to have a prevalent study, because some countries around the world would actually say this is how many older people get affected by elder abuse. So in Australia, 1 in 6, so 15% of older Australians, after doing a prevalent study, to measure all of this. This is the data that they came up with. You know, this is probably about 3 years ago. They did this study of several thousand older people, um, uh, and so 15% of people experience abuse, which is a lot. If you know, I can't remember the population of elder abuse, of population of older people. But let's say, for argument's sake, there's 2 million older people. 15% of that is 300,000. So in any given 12-month period, there's 300,000 people experiencing abuse. But it would be more than 2 million people. So, and there it has so these figures from the prevalence study were interesting to people who worked in organisations like mine, because the prevalence study came up with psychological abuse being the biggest form of abuse, whereas when we were working on the ground, it was more financial abuse, is what people would come to us, you know, in terms of service, to get a service from a service provider organisation. It was predominantly financial abuse. They would come looking for support. So there's probably a lot of people experiencing psychological abuse and not going to any service provider. Any questions at all?
Where you've got almost 2/3 of older people don't seek help, why do you think that is? The 2/3.
Because a lot of people don't seek help because of shame and embarrassment. because the abuse is perpetrated by a person that they trust, and that person is often a family member, they feel embarrassed or a sense of shame that their son or daughter, for example, perpetrated that abuse towards them.
How about retribution, or would people fear that the person
Yes,
perpetrating the
yeah. There was a lot of that.
yeah they
So
worry
there
that
was
something would happen,
there,
they would do something to them.
yeah, and there was an example that I heard of. Uh, I'm just giving this example where a neighbour kept getting rocks thrown over their back fence, and the rocks had bits of paper around it. And they started unwrapping the rocks, and they would realize that there were handwritten notes on the bit of paper. And the series of notes said something like, "My son has me locked in this bedroom out the back. He's feeding me once a day," whatever the story was, feeding me once a day. Can you please get help? And so that the neighbor had to discreetly, call the police. And then, of course, when the police knock on the door, it's hard for the older person to stay in front of the perpetrator what's going on. It's like any domestic violence situation, it's hard for the victims of domestic violence to talk about it in front of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And in many examples, it is sorry, I forget where I was going with that. But anyway, there was a prevalent study. They didn't actually explore LGBTI issues. We lobbied for them to do so. And they, even though we set up focus groups for the prevalent study with that included LGBTI people, they just didn't yield enough data. So they're doing a specific subset for LGBTI. But for this group, in terms of HIV, they would never do a subset right down to HIV because there's so many chronic illnesses that older people live with. I mean, then they would be looking at, older people with diabetes and abuse, and older people with cancers and abuse. And, so they don't necessarily get down into, or they're not likely to get down into the weeds like that. But again, for this group, is the Futures study still happening?
Yes.
Or the equivalent?
Yes.
I mean, it would be good to lobby in that around growing older and whether people experience abuse as a series of questions to explore.
Good idea, Russell. It's David Menadue here.
Yeah.
Just apart from going to the police, what other actions? I mean, you might be doing slides coming up about this. Can your organisation or anyone else do to sort of like negotiate the situation to improve it? I mean, a lot of people won't go to the police. You can understand why. They don't want to.
So the organisation that I used to run was Seniors Rights Service in New South Wales, and there's similar organisations in every state and territory. So that's why we set up EAAA as a peak body, because there was no peak. So you can imagine This and your local community legal centre, for example, they're good places to go to. In Victoria, you've got I can't remember the name of it now. Elder Rights Advocacy, I think it is. Elder
Yeah,
Rights
something like that.
Advocacy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and if you go to that website, compass.info, you'll be able to do, if you can go to each state and territory, and you could pull up probably half a dozen organisations in each state and territory. So and what I'm talking about there are community-based organisations. So
a general rule, will they consult with both parties, or how do you rectify something like that?
It depends what the situation is. I mean, now, because there's been so much lobbying in the last 10 to 15 years, there are laws in different states and territories. Like in New South Wales, there's now the Age and Disability Commission, which has its own powers to investigate issues of abuse and neglect for older people and people with disability. That's only been around for less, 5 years, really, 5-6 years. That commission. There's similar commissions in some other states, South Australia. I'm not sure about Victoria. But anyway, there are community-based organisations you can go to. And the police, again, at least in New South Wales, they do have like an older person's task force or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Next slide. So, yeah, I mean, in essence, I've sort of covered a lot of that. I've borrowed these slides, but basically from EAAA, so I've covered a lot of this already. But I will go to if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to go to the fourth bullet point, the generational wealth transfer. And I think that goes to what you were talking about before, Bev, about people wanting inheritance. So because there's such disparity around generational wealth, that's putting a lot of pressure on abuse and you know we did a lot of work with the Australian Banking Association, and banks now have training for their staff around elder abuse and for their staff what they need to look out for, because sometimes a son can go into a bank branch with a what do you call it? A power of attorney document, and demand that $50,000 be transferred from one account to the other. And if someone had that document, probably 20 years ago, that transfer could happen. Whereas now they would put limits on it, and they would also check with the older person. Yeah.
Sorry, Russell. I don't know what conservancy means.
Which bullet point?
Bullet point 4. It says inheritance, impatience, and conservancy.
Conservancy. That's when you've got the power of attorney. It's another word for what was that? Britney Spears. Remember Britney Spears?
Yeah.
her father had a conservancy. I wouldn't, sorry, if I was putting these slides together, I wouldn't have used that word. It's an American word, and in essence, it's around having power of attorney for somebody. Yeah.
So it's sort of like a guardian or something that oversees.
Yes, correct. Yeah. Okay. Next slide. So, and that just shows you those purple segments, and the growing aging population that we all keep hearing about, how the aging population is growing. So there will just, be more of these issues as the population grows older. Next slide. And so ageism, drives elder abuse. And so ageism, the stereotyping, discrimination, and mistreatment based solely upon age. So I think this is a good point for discussion, because I think ageism is part of all of us, including me. I think we all sometimes sort of roll our eyes or make a negative remark on occasions about somebody who might be older. It's just sort of the way society has shaped us. And we need to keep that in check, because it is ageism. When that gets out of control, that is the driver of elder abuse.
You hear that a lot on the road. Silly old.
Well, exactly. So I think the next slide, I've got that point. If you go to the next slide. Yes, this is what I want to do. So this is where I wanted to go. Like, are you ageist? So someone mentioned about driving on the roads. So politicians, I'll openly admit that I'm not a Donald Trump fan. And sometimes I see myself going, oh yes, God, he's getting so old and he shouldn't be in that position. But maybe that's just my bias. Maybe he can perform in that role. Maybe Joe Biden could have performed in that role. So again, it's about keeping ourselves in check. And I've got here pop stars. A pop star's too old. I have friends of mine who would put posts on Facebook going, oh, look at Madonna. Who does she think she is? Look how old she is, and she's doing this, and da da da. And that's ageism. And the point that somebody made about being on the road, we often might be at an intersection and somebody's not moving their car, and you think, oh, silly old fool, for God's sake, just move your car, and the whole intersection would get flowing again. And so we just immediately make those negative remarks and have those negative thoughts about somebody because they're older. And it's that if we don't keep that in check, that is what turns into abuse, or potentially can turn into abuse. So that's where I just wanted to end the presentation. There's other slides, but we don't